This is Abigail Carl Clausen, and I'm here with the Rebels, Exiles, and Bridge Builders Oral History Project. Today I'm here with Pastor Steve Wall from Lebenswasser Church, and we're here at Kilometer 9, just outside of Cuauhtemoc, Chihuahua. So welcome. Thank you for participating in this project.
Thank you.
So can you briefly introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, my name's Steve Wall, and got a family. Me and my wife Debbie, we live here in the Cuauhtemoc area. We've been living here for 13 years. My wife and I were actually both born and raised in Ontario, Canada. And a couple weeks after we got married, we moved down here, and that's about 13 years ago now. And I was born and raised in a Mennonite home in Canada. My dad was a pastor of a Mennonite church from when I was 10 years old and on. And we came down here to get involved in ministry, and now we're pastoring the church here and have been for the last few years.
And so would you describe the church that you grew up in Canada, the community that you grew up in Canada, as a comparatively more liberal community than many here in Mexico?
Yeah, it was more in the liberal. Well, we were part of an EMC church, and so that kind of puts it on the spectrum a little bit. Yeah. But compared to down here, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you guys came down here 13 years ago, what kind of interactions between Mennonites and non-Mennonites were considered normal? And then which ones were considered atypical or even forbidden?
Well, for instance, I guess the more normal stuff is anything business related, right? The cross-cultural activity was definitely stronger in the business world. As soon as you got to anything that was a religious-oriented church or families like marriage or things like that, then obviously it was very frowned upon, still is. And so it's kind of like we can be friends from a distance with the Spanish people is the feeling, but we can't be a community because they, especially when we moved down here 13 years ago, then there was still no landowners in the community that were Spanish. That was still very much more closed than it is now. Yeah. And in churches as well, churches, it was very separate. We've got our church for our Mennonite people here, and we've got our church for our Spanish people over here, and we don't mix. And there was also a lot less intermarriage. Yeah. And that was just very, if you had youth and they were dating a Spanish youth, then it's kind of like, what's wrong with you type of thing. It was maybe not said in those words, but it was very felt.
There was pressure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. So coming down here, what were some of the first cross-cultural interactions that you can remember, both with the conservative Mennonite community and then also with the Mexican community?
Well, my wife and I were involved in a youth ministry when we came down here, and that was primarily with old colony youth. And so that's where we would have received our primary exposure to that. So growing up in Canada, we weren't familiar so much with what we know here as the old colony. There was old colony up there, but they lived totally different than the old colony here do. So it was very a traditional. It was much more traditional than what we had expected. We got to know them through that whole thing, and then you find out about their culture and some of the things you do and some of the things you don't do in the culture. And so that was our primary exposure to that world. And then as far as the Spanish world, it was primarily through work and working with Spanish people. My wife and I both didn't speak Spanish when we came down here. So that was a limiting factor for us to really dive into that culture. And but it happened primarily through work. At that point in time in our life, all of our ministry endeavors did not include Spanish-speaking people.
So primarily a focus on Old Colony youth.
Yeah, so the youth thing, that was an Old Colony deal. I mean, all youth were welcome, but it was primarily those that came at first. We started with a volleyball night, and we found out that if you do a sports night like that, that's an attraction factor. For sure. We provided food, that was an attraction factor. But as soon as we wanted to start preaching or getting any sort of religious activity happening, then it was always thinned out quite a bit who was there. Absolutely. But we did the volleyball thing once a week, and we used that as a way to attract them and gain their trust. And then over some months, we were able to start having some conversations with them. And then our church that we were involved with was a Mennonite church, and there was no Spanish-speaking people in the church either. And so anything that had to do with outreach or ministry was very much just the German-speaking Mennonites.
And during that time, focusing primarily on the Old Colony youth, what was the reaction from some of the Old Colony churches that you were encountering their youth?
A lot of resistance, for sure. Even not just from the Old Colony churches, even the other Mennonite churches around here, there was a lot of resistance. What we did is we had a once-a-month gathering eventually after about a year or so in the youth ministry. We had a once-a-month gathering where all the youth were welcome from any church, whatever. It was just, it was a non-church affiliated ministry, and so we had some doors open because of that.
Yeah.
But we had resistance from pretty much all the churches.
Yeah.
You know, they would put in their bulletins, don't go to the Dream Center or things like that, right?
Yeah.
That type of resistance.
Yeah.
And I think looking back on it now, it wasn't all without reason. We didn't have the strongest levels of communication with the churches. And so they weren't quite sure what we were all about, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But there was definitely resistance because we did things a little bit differently. We were a little bit more like the way our service style was, and the worship music that we sang was a little bit more contemporary. And so we were pushing some cultural boundaries there without us even knowing it, but we really were. And so, and then obviously the Old Colony, they were against it as well.
Over a period of time, do you feel like that initial resistance lessened or the dynamics changed? Yeah,
the dynamics definitely changed. There would still be resistance, especially in the Old Colony world. But we, like our church, for instance, when we started Lebenswasser, we also had we didn't have a great relationship with the churches around us. And it definitely wasn't all their fault. Again, I mean, it was a two-way thing, definitely. But those doors have gone open a lot more over the last 10 years to where we can start having some good relationships with churches around us, even though we are a little bit different in practice than they might be.
Yeah.
And we've started, I think that's a two-way street. They've gained more respect for us. We've gained more respect for them. So that's been a healthy dynamic. I know at the beginning of the church, we had quite a bit of opposition when Old Colony people would come to church and leave the church. Like people would like barricade the road and not let them drive through and start burning down our signs and throwing throwing rocks through our windows.
So it's a very high level of resistance.
Yeah, so we had that level at the beginning, but that was like, we haven't had that in the last 7 years.
For sure.
Yeah, so it really died down. Eventually they saw that, you know, we're here to stay and we're maybe not as bad as what they thought, and it's kind of all calmed down. Plus also the dynamic in the community really changed with churches in specific, because when we started Lebenswasser, there was pretty much 3 mainstream denominations of Mennonite churches, and that was it. Yeah. And then we came in. And since then, in the last 10 years, there's all sorts of churches that have started. And it has really changed the church culture and in the community. And so that also has helped people to be more accepting of something that's maybe different than the original 3 main ones.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's been good.
Exactly. So you talked a little bit about there at the beginning, the focus on Old Colony youth, and then over time, the transition to the foundation of Lebenswasser Church. What was a little bit of that transition like? How did the church itself get started?
The church itself started by, there was about 5 of us couples, friends. We all hung out, and we all were involved in a church in Hawaii, which is about an hour drive from here. And but we all wanted to have a church more in this area because we lived out here, and to go to church an hour away was a bit of a chore for us. Plus, we also had I guess a collective vision of a different type of church. In this area was very much, there was about, like I said, 3 basic brands of churches, and that was it. And they were all very similar in a lot of ways. And we felt called to go in a different direction and bring in a more contemporary service style, do like kids' church and things like that. That all wasn't being done. Even a lot of the churches did not have their service in Low German. And that was a big driving factor for us, because that's the language of the people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we felt called to do a Low German, contemporary, Spirit-led church. Yeah. And that's really where the dream started, with us 5 couples sitting around in living rooms and talking about this and dreaming about it. Yeah. So what we started is to ease in the transition, we started having church on Sunday evenings, not on Sunday mornings. So we did Sunday evening church for almost a year before we ever did a Sunday morning service.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for that was to let people come and check it out without leaving their church. They could go to church in the morning at their place and then come check out our place. But one of the reasons was also just it was more open to attract people if it wasn't like a Sunday morning official church type of thing, right? Yeah. And so we did that for almost a year, and then we transitioned. October 2007 actually is when we started doing Sunday morning church, and we officially launched it. And we had maybe a small group. We had maybe 30 to 40 people. And then it just grew very rapidly for the first couple of years. I've heard Lebenswasser described as one of the most modern or contemporary congregation here in the campus. Would you agree? And then what would you say qualifies Lebenswasser as contemporary or modern? Yeah, I would agree with that, or I think that's the perception that there is of us. And I think one of the reasons why that is just because we do church differently than most other churches around here do. We always have from our beginning. We have a different system of government. We run as an eldership run church, not as a congregationally run church. Most of the Mennonite churches around here, or all of the Mennonite churches around here, run congregationally governed. So that's something that kind of sets us apart. And then we've also embraced technology from the beginning on, and we continue to do so. We live stream our services, and we do video, and we just do church differently in that way. Another thing we do different than a lot of churches is we do our teaching in series. And we brand the series, and we have logos, and we push it like that. So that's perceived as a modern thing in this community, right? Some other communities, that's been done for years, but here's a new thing. And if you're the only kid on the block doing it, that alone sets you kind of apart, right? Yeah, absolutely. And so now some other churches have started live streaming and stuff like that, but we have been viewed as contemporary in that sense. Even our service style, like I said, our way of doing church with the kids' church, like our kids go out and do kids' church while at the same time as church is happening. So we moved away from the Sunday school model. We sing praise and worship. We moved away from the hymns. Not that we're against it. It's just we felt to reach the next generation, these were some of the things we needed to do. And so as a result, we have a church of young families, and those are the people that we're able to reach. How much of your congregation would you say was previously connected with more conservative and or traditional churches or communities? All of them. Pretty much every single one of them. A very, very small percentage of people in our church have ever been involved previously in a church like ours, including us all as leaders. We all come out of, now we don't come out of the old colony, but there is definitely a group of them that come out of the old colony. There's a smaller percentage that comes out of the old colony, but if you look at the Klayeminda and that group, then there's a large percentage that would come from there. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Let's see. And how has the decision to come to Lebenswasser impacted congregants who come from more traditional communities? Well, I was alluding to that a little bit earlier, but we've had people, especially people coming out of the old colony, their relatives will be by the road blocking that they can come to church. We had those vandalism issues. We had a young man that started coming to our church out of the old colony, and one day his parents just show up and walk right in and go and find him and pull him out of there and things like that. But that's been more with coming from the very traditional side, right? But so there's definitely been that. There's been a lot of persecution for those people coming out of the traditional side by their family members, extended family. Yeah. Like me personally and us as leaders personally, we've had next to nothing. For sure. No resistance. It's more the people that come out of that system. Absolutely. And so how do you go about navigating the tension that arises as a result of disagreements that occur between contemporary and traditional communities? I think one thing to lower the tension is try to place more of an effort on the things that we agree upon than on the things that we disagree on. And really, if you are open and honest with almost any church in this area, our foundation is the same. And I mean, we agree upon Christ is the only way to salvation. We agree upon the scriptures being our ultimate authority. Like the basic tenets of the Christian faith, we actually all agree upon. Where the disagreement comes in is how do we now live that out in practice?
Yeah.
That's the disagreement.
Yeah.
And so if we would focus on the disagreements, then it wouldn't make it any better. But if we focus on what we can do together and try to make more of an effort to actually work together and accomplish the cause of Christ together as churches, that alone opens up the doors more for fellowship.
Yeah. So something interesting that I also experienced while visiting, but also heard about, is that Lebenswasser described as a diverse and multilingual congregation. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. And that was one of the things where we were actually pushing the cultural boundaries a bit, especially 5-6 years ago. We brought in simultaneous translation into Spanish via headphones. Yeah. And we still do it every single Sunday. Yeah. And so we all of a sudden started getting Spanish people showing up to church. And we've had Spanish couples, like where both the husband and the wife are Spanish, come to our church and get involved and serve and be members and 100% involved in the church community. Yeah. We've had that, which was not very common in the community. And so that definitely pushed that whole cultural boundary. But then we also have in Lebenswasser a heavy presence of people that come from Canada that speak English. Yeah. Kind of like me and my wife. Yeah. And so that creates another multicultural deal. And all of our leadership couples are like that, which also has influenced the church quite a bit, in that we do church maybe a little bit differently than what's been done around here a lot, because of the influence that we've had from the US and Canada. And so we kind of have those three cultures that we deal with. Yeah, absolutely. And on a typical Sunday morning, like a good place to see that in action is in our kids' church. We have kids there that speak just Spanish and nothing else. We have kids there that speak just English and nothing else. Yeah. And we have kids there that speak just Low German and nothing else. Oh, yeah. So it definitely makes it a challenge to try and bridge all of that. So in the kids' church is where we see it even stronger yet than in adult church. In adult church, we are very open about it. We are called to serve the Low German speaking people primarily. Yeah. And so everything that we do in church, our preaching and all of that, our announcements, our MC and all that, this is strived to be done in Low German only. Yeah. And we make a real effort to not go into English or even Spanish, just because we feel called to serve that group of people. Yeah. In kids' church, that's not nearly as easy to do. Yeah. Because not everybody's on the same base as far as Low German goes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. So you talked a little bit about primarily the language for stuff going on in the church is Low German. I noticed some Spanish language worship music. Yep. When we sing in all four languages, actually. Spanish, English, Low German, and High German. Actually, that was another area where we pushed a cultural boundary. We started singing in Low German and translating songs into Low German that were well known in English or Spanish worship songs. And we were one of the first ones to do that. Now there's more churches that are doing that, and I think it's awesome. But to see the way people connected with worshiping God in the same language as what they spoke at home around the supper table was amazing. Yeah. Because in this community, it's very much that in church, you speak High German. Yeah. Even though many people don't know it well, they don't understand it well. Yeah. It's almost kind of gives you this impression that God speaks High German and we all speak Low German, right? Absolutely. And so we've tried to break down that whole misconception. Yeah. And so singing in Low German was one of the ways. Now we actually sing a good chunk, probably half of our songs are in Low German now. So that's been a transition. But that's one of the ways that we want to get people to be able to live out their spiritual life in the same language as what they do their everyday life. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That was a question that I had, because it seems like up until recently there weren't many Low German materials available for worship, or a lot of multimedia production being done in Low German. So how do you guys feel like you've kind of been on the forefront of that, the production of materials in Low German? Yeah. Primarily, we've done it by way of exactly the Low German worship, and then also we've been producing our messages in Low German and sending them out on podcasts and apps and video and all that. And so that has helped push it out into the forefront. We would like to be more a part of that in the future, creating actually more written material. And we actually have a lady in our church, for example, she just wrote a book 100% in Low German and produced it and printed it, and it's out in circulation now. You know, how to raise kids God's way type of thing. And so there's more of that coming out as part of what we have, what we feel our call is. And it's been interesting too, because the Low German language itself is being developed more and more as we speak. And it is actually officially a language now, finally, for the last couple of years, no longer just a dialect. And so there is actually a group of people that are actively developing and pushing it as a language. And there's more resources becoming available. Like for instance, in Bolivia right now, they're creating a full school curriculum in Low German from kindergarten to grade 9. Their eventual goal is all the way to grade 12. And so it's not just a Low German class, it's actually a Low German curriculum to do all of school in. So it's becoming developed, and we want to be a part of that. We want to help push it, and we want to be at the forefront of it, because there's a lot of people that still, that's their conversational language. And so we feel, if we're going to speak it anyways, then let's at least learn the language. Let's learn how to write it. Let's learn how to read it. Let's learn how to produce content in it, and so that we can reach more people.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something that struck me during the service, was seeing up on the screen the different points from the sermon in Low German, and seeing it written. And this, like, primarily, you know, the experience in the past, you know, growing up in Seminole was like, okay, this is an oral language. Everything written is in High German. And so that was really interesting for me to see. And then I think, you know, a lot of people gaining literacy in Low German, like it's just a whole new thing.
And that's actually one of the reasons why we came up with that idea of, like, I use a TV beside me when I preach, and that's where I put my presentation, and I do it all in Low German. We did that. One of the main reasons was specifically to help people learn how to read it and to get used to seeing it, the Low German language written. And also we do it because we want our messages to be practical. And so that they can live it out and it applies to their life. And so we like to teach it in such a way so that they remember it easier. And so that's another area where we have pushed the boundaries a little bit, because there's really no other churches around here doing that in Low German. It is still very much like, if as soon as you write something, it's written in High German, but the talking is done in Low German. Another thing that we've made quite an effort is reading the Bible in our church. We read it always in Low German. Whereas in, again, most churches around here, the preacher might speak in Low German already in some cases, but he would for sure read the Bible in High German. And so we've moved away from that, again, tying into this idea that our faith language should be the same language that we speak at home around the table. And so that's why we really strive to do everything in Low German. I mean, it's definitely come at a cost, because I don't read and write Low German fluently. So now I have to type up my stuff in Low German. So it's a challenge. But I mean, there's computer programs in Low German that help with all that.
Absolutely.
So it's been developing more and making it easier for guys like us who want to get into the language to do it in a more excellent way.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Something that I was wondering about is the language preferences of youth versus the older generation.
Our youth is definitely done 90% in English, especially the hangout time. We still make an effort to preach in Low German at youth. But it is so easy to kind of start doing this half English, half German type of thing.
For sure, absolutely.
Especially for me, like, my mother tongue is English, not Low German. And so if I'm preaching at youth and they all understand English, or 98% do, then it's easy to mix that in there. The problem is we do have a couple of youth that don't understand English at all. They come from a more traditional background. And so we want to serve them as well. And so we still strive to do the preaching in German. But if you were at an actual youth night and listen to all the activities that are going on, there's hangout time, there's small groups that they do. There's a lot of English spoken there. And our youth is definitely moving in that direction. Now, some other churches in the community, that have maybe a slightly different dynamic. They don't have as heavily of an influence from Canada or the US as our particular church does.
Yeah.
Their youth would move more into Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And, they might be more educated in universities here and things like that. And so when you're hanging out with those youth, you'll hear more Spanish.
Yeah.
But still a heavy English presence in almost all of them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's see. What are some ways that Lebenswasser partners with primarily Spanish-speaking organizations or congregations?
One thing that we do is through some missions outreaches, we partner up with a couple of different organizations. One of them is actually Vida 180, and it's a orphanage that's here in Cuauhtemoc. It's actually run by a couple from our church, and they have just Spanish kids in the orphanage. And so the church has teamed up and support them and in prayer and financially, and we go and visit and hang out with them and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's through outreach programs more so than it is through an integrated part of ministry. We do have, like I said, we have some Spanish people in church, and so we have a small groups program in our church. So we have a Spanish small group, and it's integrated in that sense.
Yeah.
But we also have an organization that we support in the mountains doing ministry to the indigenous in Zacatecas, which is a different state further south.
Yeah.
And we have a good partnership there with a Spanish pastor that lives in the mountains ministering to the indigenous.
Yeah.
Actually, one of our church guys is on the board there. He's been a part of that ministry for 13 years or so. And so we have a strong relationship there. We support another missions cause here more locally in the mountains to the indigenous population. So by way of outreach, we have that primary connection.
Yeah.
We've also started developing some relationships with Spanish-speaking churches in the community. There's a new church starting in Cuauhtemoc that's coming from Delicias. And so just developing a relationship there with the pastor. Actually, about 2 months ago, we did a joint youth worship night with their church and our church.
Yeah.
Obviously, the event is done in Spanish then.
Yeah.
But we did it at our church. And so our worship team played half the set, and then the pastor came up and preached in Spanish. Their pastor preached in Spanish. Then their team came up and played the last part of the worship set. And then the youth just hung out all together. So we had about 280 youth, just, half of them roughly from the Spanish-speaking community, half from the Mennonite-speaking community.
Yeah.
And we just did that specifically as a cross-cultural event to try and improve the relationship between the different cultures.
Oh, wonderful. What are some relationships that you have with primarily Plotich-speaking organizations or communities?
They're just, it would be the local churches by way of relationships with their pastors. My dad, who is also a pastor at our church, he teaches at the Bible school in Steinreich.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so he teaches a couple of classes there. He's taught there for years already. So that's one of our primary connections. Another thing is we are currently developing a mentorship program for churches because people start coming and asking, what are you guys doing and how can you help us and what can we learn from you?
Yeah.
And so we're opening up our doors there to other Low German churches to where we want to welcome them in more and start creating more of a relationship and a dialogue on how do we do church, not just we as Lebenswasser, but as Low German speaking people, how can we become better at what we're doing and learn from each other.
Yeah.
So that's an initiative that we have in place right now as well. We also partook in the Plotich Medien Conference.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of that, but it was actually here in the community in September.
Yeah.
And so there was people there from all over the world, Canada, US, Mexico, Belize, Paraguay, Bolivia, Germany. Those were the primary presences that were there. And so it was just people coming together who are using media and Low German and mixing those together. And so we're part of organizations like that and contributing wherever we can just to create more of a network of people that work together.
Yeah. Let's see. What are some of the ways that Lebenswasser has been influenced by Latin American evangelical or charismatic worship styles and or church programs?
I would say we've been influenced a lot more by American charismatic worship styles, more so than the Latin American.
Yeah.
Again, coming back to our leadership being heavily influenced by Canadian culture. We've almost all lived in Canada.
Yeah.
And so the primary influence has been that way. We have been influenced in the Latin American world by way of a ministry called Jesus Responde, which is from Paraguay. It's actually run by German-speaking Mennonites, but it is a Spanish ministry.
Yeah, yeah.
And so Walter Neufeld is the guy that runs that, and he's an evangelist, and they do all sorts of evangelism events in Paraguay. We've had them here numerous times. In Lebenswasser. He's been in the community here teaching about evangelism. And so there's been a connection there which has opened the door to the whole Spanish, the Latino world a little bit more because they are more experienced in that world.
Yeah, for sure.
And doing Spanish ministry and things like that. Again, because of our leadership, our church's leadership coming from Canada, we've never been truly that strong in Spanish because a lot of us aren't fluent in Spanish or haven't been fluent in Spanish.
Yeah.
And so it limited it in a sense. So that's why it was kind of interesting for us to see Spanish people starting to come to church and such. It created, we were glad to see it, but it also created some tension there because we couldn't properly serve them.
Right,
just because of language barriers, right?
And what were some of the ways that they were drawn into the congregation? Through relationships with Mennonite people?
Yeah, that's always a primary one. And you see that happening. But then we also, like I said, we had people coming to church that were both of them were Spanish. And they were just attracted to the way we did things.
Oh, for sure.
Right. And the level of, level of excellence that they saw that we were doing was something that attracted them.
Yeah.
And because that is one of the weaknesses that we have seen even in the Latin American church world, is that at times, unfortunately, there's a perceived as a lack of excellence. So they came out of that world and they came to ours and saw a lot of the things that they did like from the Latino world as far as lively services and worship and all that. So those were the things they liked. But they also saw a different level of organization and excellence and commitment to time structures and things like that that they also valued. And so then they came and were drawn in by that.
Let's see. So on a more personal level, what are some cross-cultural connections that you and your family have made that have made an impact on your lives?
One of the things that I would think of in that is, again, coming back to Vida 180, Denver and Tina Penner, who run that. They're close personal friends of ours. And that's something that we've always been excited about and bought into, the whole ministry that's happening there. So what we did in our church a few years ago is we, at Christmas time, we did it for a couple of years, but all of the kids got placed in a family right over Christmas. In one of our church families, the orphan kids. And so they did Christmas with us. We bought them presents. They were just a part of it. And that developed relationships, even for my kids, that they still have on a level today. And it's changed the way that it's changed our perception even on life. Just having that personal, close touch with somebody of the Latin American culture who's in need and who we can help. And so that was a thing that changed our family personally in a big way. And like I said, our kids unfortunately are not fluent in Spanish. We're working on that right now, actually. But just bringing in a Spanish tutor to the house and things like that, letting them be exposed to the culture. And seeing some things of the culture. We took a family trip down to southern Mexico, and we were there for a couple of weeks a few years ago, and it was also a cultural experience seeing the Spanish culture in action more. We went to go see some of the places that are important to the Spanish heritage and all that, and learning about it has created a greater appreciation in us for that part of the national history and even the effect that has had on the Mennonite world. Absolutely. So those are some of the things. Developing personal relationships with some pastors in town and learning from them and seeing that they have a lot to contribute to our faith walk and our church walk, knowing how to do church, that we can learn from them and in humility. So that's been good for us.
So for a lot of people, life in the campus has changed dramatically in a relatively short amount of time. What do you think has spurred those changes? And what ways were those interactions that you had with people different than people from previous generations?
I think that one of the biggest things that has changed the culture in the campus is just the ever-increasing presence of technology.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is because before it was a lot easier to put these walls up around the community, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Obviously not literal walls, but it was much more isolated.
Yeah.
Now with, our modern day and age, everyone's got a phone with internet on it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more connection to the outside world.
Yeah.
Also, we're seeing trends of education levels going higher. More people are going to university, of Mennonite youth. All those things are combining to create massive, fast change in the culture.
Yeah.
And so it's that, as well as there was a kind of an uprising of this feeling of discontentment, even in the Mennonite culture, with the way things had always been. It was no longer enough. It was no longer good enough. There had to be more. Yeah. And there was also a spiritual awakening. The spiritual climate amongst the Low German speaking Mennonites is more hungry than it's ever been. Yeah. And I hear that from all over the world. Yeah. And so it's like it's a move of God coupled with technology and all the changes that that's bringing with it. Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, it's not all good technology, but again, coming back to our church philosophy is let's use the tools that God has given us to reach as many people as possible. Yeah. Technology is a big one of those, and it's a carrier of cultural change. So let's use it for good. Yeah, yeah. Let's see. So the name of this project is Rebels, Exiles, and Bridge Builders. Which of these words, if any, would you use to describe your cross-cultural interactions? I was thinking about that, and actually every one of those words describes me in one certain way or another. When we started the church, it was very much viewed and perceived as rebels. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And then that resulted in exiles. Yeah. Because we were doing things differently, still do things differently than the status quo is here. Yeah. And so by certain groups, that is seen as a threat and as a bad thing. But lately, by the grace of God, I would say it's becoming even more bridge building, which is, I view that as a very healthy thing, because I feel like as long as we have our foundation the same, which is Christ and Him being the only way to salvation, then really we're all on the same team. Yeah. We might play different parts of the game, and we might have different specialties in the game, but we're in the same game. Yeah. And so now we're making a much more of an effort to be more bridge building, even with other churches, and so that they wouldn't view us as a threat, but rather as a partner. Yeah. Yeah. And so that is the phase that we're entering into right now. Yeah. That also is coupled in with the change that is happening in the community in general, where they become more accepting of things that are different than what the status quo had been. Yeah. And part of that is just because they're seeing that there's results in changing some things. And some things are very ripe for change. Yeah. And they're seeing that themselves. Yeah. And so it's kind of in a sense been a vindication, but it has also been something that has needed the time, it's needed the positive results, and it's needed the whole community culture to change the way it did in order for us to be as accepted as we are now. Yeah. So I often say that 10 years ago Lebenswasser started. 10 years before that, the culture would not have been ready for us to start a church like we did. It wouldn't have succeeded. There was churches somewhat similar that started 20 and 30 years before that, and they failed because it was too radical. The timing wasn't right. Yeah, for sure. So the timing became more right, and then by the grace of God, it worked this time around. And it'll be exciting to see what happens in the future, and seeing how positive change will continue to happen in the community, and our relationships will be improved with the culture of the country.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've often looked to some other countries and examples of some things, even in Paraguay, that the Mennonites have been doing there to reach out in a bigger way cross-culturally, and trying to learn from that, because we have a lot to grow here in Mexico in that regard. And I think even for our future longevity in this country, it's going to be necessary to keep growing in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation today.
No problem. Thank you. My pleasure.